Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the University of Washington College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to this 14th Denman Forestry Issues series entitled Sustainable Urban Ecosystems, Human Dimensions and Management. We look forward today to an exciting and informative program as we begin to investigate a series of issues dealing with natural and environmental resources found in urban and urbanizing regions of our state and beyond. In visualizing the size, the ecological diversity, and land use pressures of the Pacific Northwest region, picture in your mind the gradient of land use change as we proceed from, say, downtown Seattle, Everett, Tacoma, or Portland, eastward through the foothills of the Cascades and out into the forest lands that lie to the east. Or picture yourself in one of those cities and move westward out towards the Pacific Ocean. This window box to wildlands land use gradient depicts the pressures that an urbanizing society creates on the natural systems of our region and is one of the purposes we are gathered here today to discuss ways that we might sustain our urban ecosystems as these pressures mount. This subject is in keeping with the purpose of the Denman Forestry Issues series, which is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resource issues facing our region. As with all the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and to educate our students, our faculty, and our staff, as well as resource professionals, citizens groups, landowners, and the general public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment for Student Excellence in Forest Resources. And they support the college's vision as a world-class and internationally recognized source of knowledge relevant to environmental and natural resource issues. The mission of our college is to study and investigate the sustainability and functionality of complex natural resource and environmental systems in both natural and managed environments using an interdisciplinary approach across multiple spatial and temporal scales to include our urban, suburban, and wildland landscapes. Today, we wish to focus on a variety of issues related to the creation and maintenance of sustainable urban ecosystems or urban environments. We will hear presentations covering the impact of development on urban ecosystems, interactions between urban ecosystems and humans, management issues related to urban parks and urban forests, and the role of botanic gardens in our urban environments. Today, our program covers a range of social management and ecological aspects of sustaining our urban ecosystems. The physical and biological aspects were discussed in an earlier Denman program. With us today to discuss these and other topics are speakers from city government, nonprofit organizations, and higher education. Our topic, again, is sustainable urban ecosystems, human dimensions, and management. And our moderator is Professor Sarah Reichert from the University of Washington College of Forest Resources and the University of Washington Botanic Gardens. Sarah?
Thank you, Dean Beer. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kathy Wolf. She's a research social scientist in the College of Forest Resources at the University of Washington. She uses theory and methods of environmental psychology to better understand human dimensions of urban forestry and urban ecosystems. Kathy is particularly interested in how scientific information is integrated into local government policy and practice. She has traveled the world presenting her research and has made presentations in Japan, Europe, Canada, throughout the United States, and many other places. She has a PhD in landscape architecture from the University of Michigan.
Hello, everyone. I have the privilege of kicking off this afternoon's event. We have a number of very interesting topics and speakers. My presentation is about the human dimensions of urban ecology. And I have a little under 20 minutes to cover something that is really a quite complex topic. When we consider urban ecology, we're talking about biophysical complexity, of course, but also psychosocial complexity. And where some of the other speakers this afternoon will be talking about how one manages, stewards, sustains urban ecology, I'll be talking a little bit more about why we do that, addressing the psychosocial dimensions. What are human dimensions? Well, there are a variety of topics that people have considered. These categories capture many of those: social benefits, values, including economics, stakeholders, users, environmental justice, and then individual perceptions, values, and attitudes. And combined, this sort of knowledge then can help inform and perhaps augment and improve the ways in which we manage our urban ecology and urban ecosystems. Who does this work? Well, there are a variety of social science disciplines. I'm embedded, or the work that I do is embedded in psychology. There are also social psychologists, sociologists, economists, political science, anthropology, and geography. So what we see here is a gradation of scale from understanding the individual's relationship to the environment and to urban ecology, scaling up to communities, societies, government entities, and ultimately our entire planet. Why is this important? Well, I sense that many of you in this room already know why it's important. So I'm hoping that you'll glean something, some new ideas, some new thoughts about all this as I'm speaking. But in many instances, when we go to decision makers, when we go to policy discussions, there's not necessarily the depth of understanding about the importance of these sorts of issues. So having this sort of information, having these sorts of scientific outcomes tend to or could better inform our decision making as a society. And what we need to do is think of these things as comprehensive systems. So urban ecology is not a site-by-site sort of activity or site-by-site sort of management. But in order to achieve the benefits, the environmental services, the human services afforded by ecological systems, we have to look at the big picture. And a number of the speakers this afternoon will be talking about that. So what I'm going to do in this brief amount of time is kind of break out these topics into two dimensions. One is this idea of eco-origin. So when we're talking about urban ecosystems, in some instances we're talking about remnant patches of our native environment. And we're very fortunate here in the Northwest to still have some of that within our cities. There are other cities in the country and indeed around the world that no longer have significant native nature elements within their confines. And then we move to constructed nature, those places that would not be there if it were not for human activity or human agency or human intent. And across those then, there is a range of human experience, from the passive, from us walking out into a place during a break and enjoying the plant materials, the outdoor spaces, to those people, volunteers, people who engage in urban ecology within their neighborhoods and communities. So eco-origin, just to sort of prompt some thoughts about what is urban ecology. And within environmental psychology, there's a bit of literature about this. How do we perceive nature? What is nature? What is its meaning for us? So here are a few images to kind of nudge some thought about those things. Urban forests, urban riparian areas, again, these are some of those patch remnant areas. This picture was taken near my home, and it's probably third growth forest, but nonetheless, the plant associations and the composition of this ecosystem are very similar to what we find or did find in many of our Northwest lowland forests. But urban forests can and do, we now know from a scientific basis, can and do generate similar services as do those remnant forests. So things such as water quality, air quality, stormwater management, Trees don't know whether they're in a park like this or whether they're in a native forest as far as generating ecosystem services. May differ in kind, may differ in quantity, but still valued for what they provide for society. And some wonderful restoration work going on. This is in central Washington near Ellensburg on the Central Washington University campus. So this is a plaza area designed for stormwater management as well as to let the students come to understand a little bit more about the native ecology of the central part of the state, including the geology as well. You may recognize this. If you're like me, you spend a lot of money at REI. And it's remarkable how that landscape has grown in a relatively small amount of months, days, years. And so we see, here's an example that with intention and probably a good bit of capital, you can create urban ecosystems and urban ecological functions within our cities. Pierce County is doing some interesting work at Chambers Creek. This presents perhaps some of our greatest challenge, and that is impervious surface. This amount of asphalt is collecting water. Where does it go? Well, traditionally it has gone into a pipe and moved very quickly away from the site into other locations. But in this instance, and others like it around the region, stormwater management is happening on site. So water is being collected in these spaces and moved through a series of artificial wetlands, most of the water being collected and reabsorbed on site. And that sort of ecological function can even happen in very formal landscapes. So this small courtyard within this residential area may not be able to see clearly, but there are depressions within these plantings, rain gardens then, that collect water and are designed to provide absorption and taking that water back into the groundwater, into the soil systems. I'm really enjoying seeing this as I travel around, where we have typically thought about urban ecology as that which is in the soil and on the land. We are seeing in cities, particularly those that have very high residential density, vertical forests. So where we talk about forest structure in a traditional sense of the various layers of vegetation that one would find, say, within a coniferous forest, what we're seeing in some cities is vertical forest structure, so that there are planting spaces engineered into the buildings, into parking structures, and we're finding then those ecological services being provided as well as amenity values and aesthetics as you move through different parts of the buildings or a complex. One of the best examples here, we have a prairie, a restoration planting on the top of the City Hall of the City of Chicago. Using native species, the intent here is stormwater management. It's also to reduce heating and cooling costs of the building, which they have effectively done. But they've also created a patch of Midwest prairie on this building that is several hundred feet above the ground. A recent visit to Nashville, I talked with the designer of this roof garden, and they have used native materials. They were very interested to find that within 1 year, native pollinators had come in and discovered this garden. Again, it's 4 stories above the ground, and the animals, the creatures, the associated species are finding these spaces. Another interesting project, West Manhattan, an abandoned railway line, overgrown with invasive species, but the community has taken an interest, and there is now a proposal to create a 1.5-mile trail system. So this is a rails to trails in a very urban setting. And a Dutch designer has proposed a varied and wild mix of native grasses, flowering meadows, and woody thickets in order to landscape this high ground trail system. So now I'll turn to this other dimension of human experience, from active to passive. And what I'm going to do is talk very quickly in some phrases. Some are emergent. Some of these ideas are emergent. Some are fairly well accepted within the literature. While I'm not presenting graphs and charts, there is a long and deep literature in these sorts of things. And what we can do is think about this as civic ecology. And traditionally, perhaps, we tend to think of ecology as something that the scientists do. and they generate findings, and they publish the outcomes. And then the general public takes this information and perhaps integrates it into policy, decision-making, and management. But what I propose here, what is emerging in this country and here in the Northwest, is the idea that people are engaged in ecology for civic purposes. So not only for ecosystem services, but also for the benefits that are provided to communities. So here, for instance, in one community, a system of rain gardens was developed in this abandoned lot, and it has become one of the favorite play places within the community. Passive experiences, we know that there are a variety of benefits from encounters, brief, occasional encounters with outdoor space. Community gardens are another example. These are often the transitional uses of abandoned lots or unused properties in our cities, and they become a nexus. They become a hub for a community and a variety of values and a variety of benefits, in addition to, obviously, the food that is produced here. What are some of those benefits of being in contact with nature in a passive sense, and that is just walking through it, biking through it, driving through it? Here are some of the findings, and again, if you consider this presentation a portal to a much broader literature and a lot of ideas from a lot of people. If you'd like more information, by all means, contact me later at another time. But anyway, lower crime rates, job satisfaction is impacted by people's visual contact with nature on the job. Really interesting work with children. ADHD symptoms are reduced. This, again, is empirical findings. If children spend a certain amount of time in green spaces, in addition to other activities to treat ADHD. A colleague of mine in Japan started a recreational tree climbing organization, and before they knew it, it became a therapeutic tree climbing organization. So people with emotional and physical disabilities are training to climb trees. So the combination of preparing oneself to actively climb trees, as well as a sense of satisfaction once you do that, is turning out to have some very positive benefits. For instance, this group of kids, you may be able to see, each of them has an impairment of fingers or toes. No one really knows why, but this Magic Fingers group is one that the kids are up there climbing trees and gaining a variety of emotional benefits from doing so. Parks, open space, trails, we intuitively recognize the benefits. Health and well-being being important. Roger Ulrich has done a number of studies on illness recovery, stress recovery, having to do with passive experiences of nature, and that extends as well to the driving experience. Our commute, back and forth, from the office to work, whatever. It makes a difference if that roadway is green. Walkability. Studies are now appearing, Centers for Disease Control, NIH, studies are starting to appear, and here as well, within our urban ecology program, that having green environments is an inducement or a motivation to get out and walk. Placing the sidewalk is one thing, but building it may not necessarily bring them to it. You've also got to have an environment that favors or is favorable for walking. This is important stuff. I mean, we're talking about a really moderate amount of recommended daily activity, which people in the United States generally are not achieving. And that is then generating great costs for our society. Turn now to more active involvement with nature. Earth Corps is an organization, a nonprofit here in the city of Seattle that enables young people from K through 12 to post baccalaureate to get involved in restoration projects. And these young people gain service skills, work skills, leadership, and they take that on either into natural resources careers, natural resources interests, or into other dimensions of public service in our communities. Is this an ecological site? Yeah, maybe. Depends on your perspective, depends on your definition. But compare this is the same site. So there on the right was that school ground. On the left, the small insert, This community decided that they wanted more green around their schools. So check out that little reading circle. That was the first step. The kids insisted, we want something symbolic, we want something to show that change is happening. So this reading circle was done within the community or with community involvement, preceded then or followed by the removal of all asphalt. Kids were involved in the planting at all phases. And another way that people engage in their communities with nature is community gardens. We know that not only do they provide food, they can be an element in stormwater management, but they become the third place in many communities. So just as Starbucks tells us that that's the place to be if we're not at work or if we're not at home, the third place, these gardens often serve that function as well, a place where people can get together, talk, get to know each other, develop some social and natural capital simultaneously. So why is this all important? Just to wrap things up here. On an individual basis, having nature in our cities, having functional ecosystems in our cities improves how people function. It's fundamental to who we are and what we do. It's important for public health and welfare. And many times young people who are involved in these projects develop skills and capacities that transfer to other elements and other dimensions of their lives. And they become an active component or an active contributor to sustainability in our cities rather than a spectator as others are telling them what should be done or what could be done. Why is this important for communities? First of all, urban greening, urban ecosystems create vibrant, livable cities. If we want to protect the productive lands, working landscapes out beyond our cities, we have to create cities that people want to live in. And landscapes help us do that. Environmental services, human services are provided. And there are now people talking about security and democracy being linked to community activity. And urban greening is but one strategy that we can use to engage people more actively in their community and get to know people and develop those social systems that enable people to resist any threats at whatever level that might happen. So thank you.
Our next speaker will be Professor Marina Aliberti. She's an associate professor of urban and environmental planning in the Department of Urban Design and Planning at the University of Washington. Her research interests are on the impacts of alternative urban development patterns on ecosystem dynamics. She also directs the interdisciplinary PhD program in urban design and planning and the Urban Ecology Research Laboratory. Her PhD is in urban design and planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
I'd like to start by reminding us that the extraordinary impact of urbanization on planet Earth has been made visible from space by this picture that is very well known. And several years ago, NASA took this satellite picture of night lights, which represents very clearly the enormous and dramatic impact that urbanization is having on the planet. What is less known is the pace with which we, as humans, are transforming the landscape. And this is the Central Puget Sound. So this simulation represents the land transformation over the last 100 years. We built these simulations using year-built data that are available for several counties in Puget Sound, and those are the Central Puget Sound counties, including Snohomish, King, Kitsap, and Pierce. And as you know, the Central Puget Sound currently houses more than 3.4 million people, and it is expected to reach 4.7 million people by 2030. So if people are here to stay, or more people are coming, the question that we are asking is how we can develop patterns that are more sustainable. So in this presentation, what I'll try to do is to propose that the pattern that we see in the landscape are evolved from the interactions among multiple agents and decisions that as people businesses, governments make, and the way in which those interact with the infrastructure that we build, including the transportation, the water, the sewer, and energy infrastructure, and the emerging patterns affect ecosystem processes through multiple mechanisms, including the generation and emission waste, the conversion of land, the use of resources, the demand of resources. Ultimately, though, those changes have a feedback on the decisions and of people and their well-being. Now, there is a large and increasing body of literature on how urbanization and urban patterns affect ecosystem functions through a number of mechanisms, if you want, stressors, such as habitat fragmentation or impervious surfaces, replacement of the riparian vegetation, and how those change the primary productivity of the region and the hydrology, the biodiversity. And those are simply some examples. But as I said, the literature is definitely increasing. What is less known is the linkages between the interactions between the human and ecological functions. So in this presentation, what I am proposing is that urban landscape patterns are actually emerging from the interaction between what we call human functions, and meaning the housing, accessibility, natural amenities, the functions that we have as humans, and ecological functions, such as forest functions, biodiversity, hydrology, nutrient cycling. Those coexist in an urbanizing region. And in my lab, we're interested in understanding the dynamic interactions among ecological and human functions, how those form urban patterns, and then how those emerging patterns affect the ability to maintain ecological and human functions in urbanizing region. We are interested in studying 4 patterns. Primarily, those are dimensions, if we want, not really metrics of those patterns. The density, heterogeneity, connectivity, and form of the urban landscape. And we hypothesized that those patterns have specific ecological signatures that are, if we are able to extract what are those landscape configuration and compositions that are represented by those different patterns. We extracted from parcel data associated with land use and sampled those different land use and extracted the characteristics of the landscapes within those different patterns to see whether we were able to actually discriminate the landscape configuration and compositions of those different patterns, with the objective of learning on how to incorporate that knowledge in making those patterns more sustainable. Now, to articulate this hypothesis, I'd like to show some empirical work that we have done in my lab with a team of multiple scientists, and primarily building on a framework that we have developed and in which we identify there are a relationship between drivers of those patterns and the patterns in interaction with the processes generate certain effects, and ultimately how those effects modify our patterns. More in detail, I can say that we consider drivers of landscape patterns, both demographics, urbanization, technology, human patterns, but also human drivers, but also climate change technology. And simultaneously, those drivers generate patterns that are both biophysical as well as human development patterns. And they interact with hydrological, climate, nutrient cycling, and other biophysical processes and generate certain effect. One example would be to say that population growth and the location choice that people make with respect to where they prefer to live ultimately generate certain landscape patterns, and they interact, and therefore different building footprints and different infrastructures that lead to increased runoff, and how increased runoff or replacement of the riparian vegetation may impact fish habitat, and how then ultimately fish habitat and the consequences of decline in the fish population may actually generate impact on the regulation of land use. We're interested in understanding those interactions, and I'll focus on three major ecosystem functions. In urban ecosystems, I think that ecosystem functions, again, include human and ecological functions. And I focus on those three functions to show some empirical results. So first, we studied how urban patterns affect biotic integrity in stream through a number of mechanisms like change in runoff and replacement of riparian vegetation, and interference with the stream network. And we used the Benthic Index of Biotic Integrity, which is an index that was developed at Jim Carr here at the University of Washington, and which is known as a comprehensive index for measuring stream health. And we selected 42 basins, sub-basins of variable and different patterns of urbanization from points where we had associated Benthic Index of Biotic Integrity values. And we also developed this analysis at multiple scale across several areas in central Puget Sound. And first of all, we did confirm what other had already shown, which is that the increase in impervious surface generate altered hydrological and therefore ecological conditions. BIBI declines as the percent of total impervious area increases. The same is true for the reverse. The Benthic Index of Biotic Integrity and therefore the quality of streams increases in basins where we have a greater amount of forest cover. But what we also showed that percentage impervious surface and percentage forest in those contributing watersheds are very coarse predictor for biological conditions. In fact, there is a lot of noise, a certain level of impervious surface of trees. What we also found, though, that therefore the location or the type of impervious surface may be critical. We found, for example, the number of road crossing per kilometer of stream is probably the best predictor of ecological conditions, biotic condition in the stream. Also, we found that the aggregation, we use the aggregation index as a metric for measuring the adjacencies or aggregation of impervious surface, is a good predictor of the decline in the conditions of the stream, as well as the aggregation of forest, of course, is the reverse. So more compact patches of forest are a good predictor for better conditions in the stream. We also looked at the impact of patterns on songbirds, and John Marsleff, you may have already met him in these lectures, is part of this team, and he has led part of the research where we studied the impact of urban patterns on ecological conditions, on bird diversity through mechanisms such as the change in habitat and change in food sources, as well as nest predation, etc. And we selected also, there are 54 study sites stratified by dominant land cover and other different patterns of land cover. And just to briefly summarize, this graph summarizes the work that John has led, in which basically showing that the number of bird species in the 1 kilometer square landscape area was strongly correlated with the percentage of forest. But that also was not a linear relationship, but and peaked at 50% of the forest in the landscape. What he shows is that bird communities at the urban fringe support rich mixes of both native forest birds as well as early successional birds and also synanthropic species. Those two examples focus on ecological functions. I briefly wanted to show one of the most difficult things is to actually look at the impact of changing the land cover and changing the ecological conditions on human values. And specifically in this case, we look at real estate price. Hedonic regression models are used to typically to explain the price of goods by using certain attribute of the goods. And typically, hedonic regression models of residential property uses structural attribute of the house as well as other spatial attributes of the neighborhood, for example. Here what we did was to control for those factors and look at how the percentage of land cover within a certain distance from the parcel in fact had an impact, or whether it was significant impact, to explain the price of goods. And two of my PhD students and also Paul Waddell, together we developed this analysis and found that an increase in 10% of forest cover within a 600-meter window from the actual parcel where the land cover was measured had an impact, a significant impact of 2% increase in the sale price. Now, this sounds a small amount, but on a house of $500,000, that's $10,000. But what is more important is not the total amount, but it is the fact that there is a factor that is a preference that is revealed in the price of a good that is related to the environmental amenities that trees provide. And there are a lot of other ecosystem functions that are not quantified currently, that are provided to humans, and this is just a framework to show how that could be studied. So in conclusion, what I like to say is that there are that the interdependence that we can observe between human and ecological functions plays an unprecedented challenge to integrate science and planning to build resilient cities. And this is a challenge that I wanted to give not just to planners that should incorporate a better knowledge of ecosystem functions and how ecosystem functions support human functions, but actually also to scientists that should start to study more explicitly ecology with integrating humans in them to make ecology more relevant to the human species. Also, one other implication is that the ecological resilience in urban ecosystems, because urban ecosystems have the presence of human and natural functions, has to do with the ability to maintain both. And if we can identify different ecological signatures for patterns of urbanization, then it's clear that the way in which we build those patterns have serious consequences on the delicate balance for maintaining human and ecological function. And finally, I'd like to say that, well, there is a lot to be learned in order to design those resilient development patterns. We need to understand more explicitly the mechanisms by which urban patterns are linked to human ecological function. We need to build what we can call a mechanistic urban ecology. Thank you.
Well, our last speaker will be Professor David Mabberley. Professor Mabberley is a professor at the University of Washington College of Forest Resources and is director of the University of Washington Botanic Gardens, which comprises the Washington Park Arboretum, the Center for Urban Horticulture, the Elizabeth C. Miller Library, the Otis Douglas Hyde Herbarium, and the Union Bay Natural Area. His research interests include plant systematics and ecology, the study of economic plants, and the importance of 19th century horticulture in the scientific process. David has degrees from both Oxford and Cambridge universities in Great Britain.
Thank you and good afternoon. Of all scientific institutions, botanic gardens have perhaps the longest history, some of them existing as entities for hundreds of years. The oldest in the English-speaking world is that at the University of Oxford in England, founded in 1620, and there is indeed a handful of even older ones in continental Europe. This is Oxford in 1675, aerial view, and you can see in the top right-hand corner what passed for the first greenhouse in the United Kingdom. Many such gardens, as in the case of Oxford, sit on prime real estate, and despite the obvious economic pressures, have remained on their original sites throughout. What does this longevity tell us about their roles in society over 400 or so years? And what does it tell us about society itself? Every nation and most principal cities have botanic gardens. Developing countries are establishing them, and those with surging economies, such as China, are putting literally billions of dollars into enormous new botanic gardens. Why is this? What is it that makes such institutions so important today? Firstly, we have to consider what botanic gardens, including arboreta, are not. They are not just parks or public gardens. The well-worn definition from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature is a garden containing scientifically ordered and maintained collections of plants, usually documented and labeled, and open to the public for the purposes of recreation, education, and research. The core of their raison d'etre is the fact that they exhibit scientific collections of plants, that they're not merely there for display, though that is an important aspect of the work of many botanic gardens. They are there for education as well as recreation. It is this combination, I believe, that has kept them going for so long. Nevertheless, through time, the balance between these functions has changed, has caused tensions and indeed strife, when in essence it is the melding of these two functions that makes them, just as with other collections-based organizations like art museums and natural history museums, extremely precious to society. The early botanic gardens were entirely utilitarian in serving the very practical function of demonstrating medicinal plants. That at Oxford, for instance, was like this, and the name of the Chelsea Physic Garden in London recalls its origin and long association with the worshipful society of apothecaries. Later, with the discovery of plants overseas, botanic gardens came to be rather self-conscious attempts at reproducing the Garden of Eden. Here is an earlier depiction of the Garden of Eden by the Oberrheinische Meister of 1410, showing the Virgin and Child in a little paradise garden. And it was an attempt to reproduce this that led to John Parkinson naming his book Paradisi in Sole, Paradise in the Sun, which of course is a pun on his own name, John Park, Paradise in Sun. And you can see here, quite rightly, Adam, decently clad, attempting to graft an apple tree. The utilitarian face of botanic gardens came to an apogee in the imperial expansion of Europe. The gardens in the home countries became not merely the repository of the flood of new medicinal, but also of many other economic plants. Here you can see the 4 continents of the world presenting their economic plants to the nation of the Netherlands in 1663. And they were not merely the repositories, they became the sorting houses and trial grounds for what was to become the mass transportation of economic plants, plus their weeds, to other countries in the expanding empires. With increasingly sophisticated glass and heating technologies, these imperial centers assumed a crucial role in the economies of the colonizers and the colonized. From the Jardin du Roi, later the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, to the Hortus Botanicus in Amsterdam, as here, but perhaps supremely to what are now the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in England, what have become the major plantation crops of much of the tropical world were introduced and propagated to be sent on to an increasing network of dependent new botanic gardens in the colonies, to Mauritius, to Calcutta, to Singapore, to Java, to Sydney, to the Caribbean. And so rubber trees from the Amazon reached what is now Singapore and Malaysia to make the backbone of the economy of the former federated Malay states. They got them via Kew. Coffee from Ethiopia was introduced to South America via Amsterdam. Vanilla from Mexico went to Madagascar via Paris. Associated with this began a huge worldwide project of documentation in the form of dried, flattened specimens of the plants, what we call herbarium specimens, filed in museum fashion to record what was being grown and what was being passed on. Here is the Otis Douglas Hyde Herbarium in the University of Washington Botanic Gardens, which is largely a herbarium of cultivated plants. It is remarkably convenient for us, then, that the natural support tissues and defense compounds of land plants allow them to be preserved in this way. Lignin, cellulose, and tannins make for long-lasting specimens, something that was noted 500 years ago when the first herbarium was made in Italy, though the pressing of certain plants and the inserting of them in books to keep out insects had been known long before in China, for instance. Beginning as documenting and then accumulating private herbaria on top, these largely from private collectors or of cabinets of curiosities, as they called them, these public herbarium collections began to represent records of the flora of the world, just as the grounds and greenhouses of botanic gardens were beginning to display increasingly plants for their own sakes. The sophistication associated with growing plants for their own sakes has been intrinsic in many societies, notably China and Japan, but also in the great civilizations of Central America and even the societies of the Western Pacific. With increasing leisure in Western countries and the rise of both private and public ornamental horticulture, working men's flower clubs, royal pleasure grounds, and the importance of civic town planning, especially the provision of public parks, which we've been hearing about, as society became increasingly urbanized and disconnected from the countryside, botanic gardens moved into this new area too. And as the colonies gained independence, they often established their own new gardens, just like those in the home countries. So those gardens were founded with a display, public education, and to a lesser extent, trial ground function from the start. The result is that today there is an international network of some 2,500 botanic gardens of scientifically named and documented plants arranged for education and pleasure, while the trials function has largely been moved to research stations devoted to particular types of crop plants. The modern botanic gardens often have substantial herbaria and libraries as resources. They are often supported by private as well as public funding, increasingly in the Western world, of course, with private funding, and an array of support groups with varying independence of the gardens themselves. Recent surveys of people and botanic gardens show similar patterns all over the world. For example, a survey a couple of years ago of people attending cultural venues in Australia showed that 38.5% of the population, 38.5% of the population visited botanic gardens. This compares with 22.3% visiting art museums and 77.7% attending classical concerts. And it is only surpassed by the 62% going to the cinema and 44% attending sports events. At the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney, for example, there are 3 million visitors every year, and more than 70% of those are repeat visitors, 50% of them coming back once a month or so. Of these, 21% were said to be seeking relaxation, 18% peace and tranquility. And such results are typical of surveys conducted all around the world. As St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "You change people by delight, you change people by pleasure." So relaxed visitors are more receptive to overt or subtle messages. Typically, 91% of visitors and 83% of the general population feel that botanic gardens should provide information about plants. 71% believe they should be promoting the need for conservation. 67% say that they should be providing education about plants and about the environment in general. There is thus a huge market for these issues. The challenge, therefore, is how to make the green wallpaper created by the living collections tell a story in botanic gardens. Indeed, the importance of public education about plants is increasing as school and university curricula become apparently inexorably depleted of plant content. This is an international phenomenon. University departments of botany become amalgamated with others, so that in some universities the plant voice has become lost altogether. With human fascination with technology and its applications in biological science, there has inevitably become a crowding in of studies at the molecular end of the subject. Part of this perhaps appeasing the physics envy felt by the so-called soft-ish sciences. Basic training in plant science seems old-fashioned by comparison, and there's only a certain amount of time, after all, for a student to absorb information and techniques. Although all this could be said of learning how to add up or subtract, and I would submit that plant sciences need the basic building blocks of a decent basic training in botany. Nonetheless, Modern botanic gardens have embraced, as here at the University of Washington, in collaboration with the Department of Biology, the very latest techniques in DNA analysis in elucidating the relationships between plants. In fact, this whole aspect of plant systematics has been revolutionized in recent years. Behind the gardens and the greenhouses, there's hard science going on. On top of this, long-lived institutions like botanic gardens are more readily able to deal with the long-term projects which are the subject of our symposium today, than are some short-lived, than many other short-lived research groups. And some plants, of course, notably trees, our focus, are, after all, long-lived organisms. Botanic gardens and arboreta can take a long view. However, I remember some years ago a particular head of a botany department in England bragging that for him, a plant was so much green extract in a bottle. Such clever remarks seem to me like Neronian fiddling when we consider the plight of the world's plants and indeed ecosystems in general. Botanic gardens, rather than science departments in the narrow sense, have therefore found themselves increasingly concerned with not merely educating people about conservation, but now actively practicing it in all kinds of ways. Today, their patiently accumulated scientific collections are becoming important repositories of biodiversity. Indeed, a botanic garden like that at Oxford, which is less than 3 acres in extent, or the Washington Park Arboretum here in Seattle, one of the world's greatest collections of trees. Here, for example, is an oak. We have here in Seattle North America's most diverse collection of oak species. The Washington Park Arboretum, like the Oxford Botanic Garden, compared to vast tracts of so-called wild vegetation, they actually do contain greater biodiversity. Here, for example, is the best example of the maple collection at the Washington Park Arboretum. We have more taxa of maples than anywhere else in North America. And whilst we're bragging, we've also got the best collection of mountain ash. Now, increasingly, plants are being lost, of course, in their native habitats and survive only in cultivation. But this is not new. Ginkgos, the last of a long line of very diversified groups of ancient seed plants, survive only as a single species because they have been long cultivated for food and for veneration in China. Horticulture has long had a conservational side to it. And indeed, today, the world's botanic gardens grow over 30% of the world's known plant species. Some botanic gardens, like the University of Washington Botanic Gardens, have seed vaults. This is the Miller seed vault near this room. And these seed vaults hold propagules of species to hedge against species going extinct and to reintroduce plants into the wild when appropriate. This vault is part of an international network spearheaded by the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in its new role. One of many networks gardens belong to, notably Botanic Gardens Conservation International, to the more local American Public Gardens Association, which has a broader focus, including advocacy for the work of gardens under threat from development, for example. In 2004, at the Second World Botanic Gardens Congress, 20 goals arranged in focal areas, 20 goals for 2010 were adopted in support of the International Convention on Biological Diversity's Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, which was accepted by 188 governments. Among these is compiling, and we're at that basic stage, is compiling a working list of all known plant species. Associated with such conservation endeavors, there are, as here with our Rare Care program, not only education and sophisticated research programs, but also outreach. Indeed, the relationship with the horticultural public, and there's probably nowhere in the world with such a sophisticated horticultural public as here in the Pacific Northwest, it is indeed a two-way street, in that horticultural groups can bring to bear their long-accumulated skills in the advancement of both science and practical horticulture in botanic gardens. As part of this, a modern botanic garden must provide appropriate courses and classes, seminars and field trips, conferences, and promote expeditions. In short, modern botanic gardens are rising to the challenge posed by the issue of diminishing biodiversity in so-called natural habitats around the world. Effort is now being concentrated on how effective this is in individual gardens in terms of performance indicators, such as the amount of natural habitat managed, species established ex situ, effects on local to national policy, advocacy for sustainable uses of plants, education targets, and so forth. For, as the egregious keeper of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, recently said, botanic gardens are really the only places at the moment that have the skills to adapt the landscape to those changing conditions. Maintaining biodiversity in the face of climate change is going to be a very active process. Also to be addressed, in my opinion, is the prevailing notion of the relationship between humans and plants as one between subjects and objects, a notion deeply embedded in the Western psyche, but less so in the belief systems of the East. Because humans are indeed symbiotic with plants, there is room for recognizing a more collaborative approach. Indeed, it seems to me that this is another focus for the modern botanic garden in an urbanizing world. The issues of diminishing plant appreciation and understanding in people divorced from the countryside, and the issue of diminishing biodiversity itself. Issue-based botanic gardens must strive to show human beings' position within, rather than above, the changing biological world. We now need to see botanic gardens with issue-based sub-gardens to help society understand the ecological issues facing us. Bearing in mind that it was in universities that botanic gardens began, what does this mean for a university botanic garden? What are the other contemporary issues university botanic gardens should address? Some spring to mind. The restoration of degraded habitats, as here the Union Bay Natural Area established on the Montlake tip. The use of and demonstration and building of sustainable green buildings, as here at Merrill Hall. The problems posed by invasive plant species, perhaps second only to habitat loss in the reduction of biodiversity, the threat of global warming, the diminishing availability of water, the use of herbicides and pesticides, new sources of energy in terms of biofuels, new less demanding crop plants, the possible hazards of genetically modified organisms, and in an intellectual organization, the debate on evolution. Here then is the mission and vision of the University of Washington Botanic Gardens with an aerial photograph of our extent. Many of the issues I have outlined can be addressed with plant displays in such gardens as ours, though they will be plant displays unlike any we have been familiar with in classical botanic gardens. They will require creativity, imagination, and of course funding. Most of them relate to very utilitarian issues, just like the original botanic gardens. In short, there is a focus for botanic gardens, particularly those associated with the great universities of the world, of which the University of Washington is one. As part of our mission to engage and educate the community and to promote sustainability, university botanic gardens have come into their own. In short, modern university botanic gardens are the vehicle for engaging and educating an increasingly urbanized society worldwide about ecological issues through courses and displays, utilizing their associated resources such as outdoor labs, libraries, and herbaria. Thank you very much.